is Arcane Mark. Hello!
Hello, everybody! Welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be chatting about divinations, prophecies, and other magical clues. Things that let you peer into the past, gather more details about the present, and even gaze into all the possibilities of the future.
So if you ask about any kind of magic that GMs find difficult to run in a variety of game systems, divinations often appear near the top of the list. Whether or not that game system even has a trait or tag called divination to put on those types of spells, they tend to be some of the hardest to run. They can also be underlooked by players who are focused on big booms and blasts in terms of their power, because their power is narrative rather than battle-based.
Divinations are going to be spells and abilities that are about gathering information. And one of the things that makes them difficult is that the GM might not have that information on hand. Whether it's something that they just hadn't thought about or something that it has to do with trying to predict something that hasn't yet happened. That they can be rather tricky to deal with.
They can often put you on the spot. So with these tips, we're going to help make sure that you can run divinations so that it'll be less stressful, it'll be easier and fun for your players. And we're going to try to divide these up roughly into past, present, and future divinations. Obviously, some of the divinations that exist in various games kind of straddle the line between some of these, but there's also tips that are accurate for divinations of any of the three types.
Mm-hmm. I would say one of the ones that is definitely going to be true for all three types is to beware precise specificity.
Look exactly at what the divination spell guarantees that it's going to provide, and don't feel that you need to provide more specificity than that. Check to see if there are any restrictions on it. Does it say that it doesn't work past running water? Or if there's a thin sheet of lead, for example? Does it say that there is, that only kind of gives you a vague description of an area, but you were giving a picture of literally the every single detail of the entire area? So try to make sure that you give exactly what the spell says that it's going to grant. Mm-hmm. However, when you're doing that, this is really important. You want to make sure that the divination is granting something that feels like it's worth whatever the opportunity cost it was of learning the divination, yes, of casting the divination. If it's in a system that uses spell slots, it costs one of their spell slots of a particular level. It should feel like it was worth that spell casting, mm-hmm, and that they come out of it happy. Unless they, asked a weird question that no one would expect would get a useful answer, or that was probably either gonna all or nothing circumvent the entire adventure or not, something like that. That's okay.
Ideally, your divination is going to give some information that gives your players more insight without completely solving the problem or without backing you into a corner.
If you have to pick, then you usually don't want to make the divination go too overly wild where it just does everything. But you know what? Sometimes your group will just have the right divination, and it is mm-hmm, you're like, I'm doing a quest where I think it'll be cool if they find the magical rainbow fish of knowledge that's hidden somewhere in this ocean. And the player's like, well, thanks for your policy of allowing any spell that is ever printed by the first-party publisher, whether that's Paizo or Wizards of the mm-hmm Coast, because in the new supplement, Anglers of Golarion, they just put out, find the magical rainbow fish in whatever ocean it's in, which has a range of interplanetary, mm-hmm, and it immediately finds the fish. It also tells you where the fish will be at all times in the future in case the fish leaves, and it teleports the fish directly into your hand, and the fish can't escape from you.
Yeah, well, this actually does get into another thing about handling divination effects that I think is good to talk about in sort of this broader section, is that there's a reason why a decent number of divinations in Pathfinder 2nd Edition are uncommon. Is the idea that if something is going to be potentially disruptive to the story, that it's something that warrants a closer look as a GM. Because if you decided, yes, I'm going to allow this spell into the game, you definitely want it to work. And if you come across a spell that you're like, you know what, this, if scrying exists, then it's going to fundamentally undermine the way that this setting works. This setting is one where people can't use scrying type magic, then you can set those expectations from the start.
Where scrying type magic lets you like spy on something from a distance. And so, for instance, let's say that magical rainbow fish was like something in the setting lore that it could grant wishes, and so that's something that people knew about in advance. But if you then later in Pathfinder 2 created a spell that automatically gave you the rainbow fish, first of all, that's probably a bad design. But second of all, it would generally be rare. So the GM could be just like, sure, yes, some people found a spell to cheese out the rainbow wishing fish, but it's a rare spell, and you might not necessarily have found that spell either. Now, obviously, if you're playing D&D or a lot of other different games that don't have that kind of rarity, and it's more of a just case-by-case, did the GM ban this entire book worth of options or not, you're not going to have that same situation. But in general, sometimes your players will have exactly the divination that solves everything, and there's no point even trying to think that it didn't solve everything. But if there's any kind of wiggle room, you should err towards, like Linda said, not solving everything. Even if that means you have to go slightly towards it didn't give quite as satisfying of an amount as it should. But your ideal is something satisfying, actionable, and that drives things forward without solving it for them or being like, well, that's nothing.
Yeah. So, for example, and if you feel like what you're giving is a little bit less than maybe ideal, you can maybe give something else with it too. So, for example, if the information that's revealed gives some information about the movements of the PC's opponent, doesn't necessarily reveal like the most important thing that they did, but does allow the PCs to get some kind of treasure information that it's a reward in and of itself in addition to another valuable clue, then it's like, oh, okay, we got this treasure we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. And then we get to the end and we're better off than we would have if we solved this puzzle in another way.
Another way you can handle this is by giving out information that is more than what they asked for, but that the extra information is actually just makes them more curious and more want to find things out, right? You can be like, okay, I'm going to give them this information. That's fine. It's not going to be too much of a problem to gain it, nor is it too little for the spell. But it's not that interesting, so I'm going to throw in everything they asked for so they completely are fine with that, and this extra information, so that they are kind of confused and might want to learn more. So, for example, there was a group of 3 Fae who provided answers for prices that were always something that was truly meaningful for you that you had to give up in a setting that I was running. And so they always ask, like, who asked us this question? And when one of the characters said their name, they just sort of provided for free, that name character is dead. They just kind of said that. And they only ever speak the truth, so that was a very concerning additional divination sort of information. Like, what? I'm not dead? And so that kind of thing can make your divinations mysterious without being frustrating, because if you gave only the information that they asked for and gave that mysteriously and they couldn't understand anything about it, and especially if the spell didn't say that it's supposed to be super mysterious and hard to understand, then it can be frustrating because then the players are like, what's going on here? Whereas if it's extra, then it doesn't matter if it's a little obscure.
So then when you, it's sort of the general story making tool of like, whenever you close one door, see if you can create hooks for 2 more.
That's right.
Then you can do that with divinations too, is always hint that there's some deeper truth that you can discover, and then that is an initial hook for new adventure.
That's right. So another thing to think about, this generic advice, anytime a divination leaves things open for how it's done, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it'll be just like you see with your eyes in this other place. Or you are given an information of whether or not the future is weal or woe, and you get the words weal, woe, weal and woe, or neither. Weal nor woe. And sometimes it's very specific, but if it's vague, then that means that you, as the GM, have license. This is things like the Read Omen spell in Pathfinder, or the Divination spell from the old D&D that was just called Divination. It was in the Divination school. It was a very confusing name that would just give you this random prophecy about the future and the course of action you were doing. So these spells were very, very broad on what you could do for them. Legend lore to an extent as well. And so that when you're running something that's broad like that, think about what you are good at doing. And just focus it on that. And don't worry too much about anything else unless, like, well, I don't know, they're asking a particular deity and that deity doesn't seem like it would do things that way. So, for instance, cryptic poems are one example of what Read Omen / Divination can give you. So I liked to write poems for it. And if it was a lawful deity who was very much about strictures and order, I would have them write like sonnets. Or if it was like a deity that was from like Minkai, which is like the sort of Japanish country in Tian Sha, maybe it would do a haiku or a tanka, which have very, very specific rules to the way that the poems work. Whereas if it was a chaotic deity, then I did stuff that was like what my poetry teacher in college liked, because he never liked sonnets or anything like that. He was like a minor member of the beat movement. He knew all the other beat poets, and he was just like those things that were like profound seeming sentences, but you break them up not at the end of the sentence, so the line returns themselves cause pauses that make you ponder it more. And so I would do those for my divinations with some of the more chaotic deities and other things like that. So that's something I know, but might not be something you know. Maybe you know some more about movies.
Yeah, so maybe, if you have like a lot of, or maybe you might think more in images in that way, and you're going to be like, you're going to give the players descriptions of like sights and sounds and smells, or you show the players some pictures, or you like make an analogy to a familiar piece of media or something like that. There's a lot of different ways that you can provide that information. Another thing to consider too, like what you were saying with the deities, is the information provided from a particular perspective, and how accurate or fallible is that perspective?
So, for example, Caden Kalian, the Pathfinder deity of drunken fools and bravery and adventure, one time had a cleric in one of the games Linda was running, and we asked if this creepy tower was a good thing to go to, and Caden Kalian said wheel, which is like W-E-A-L, is like, that just means it's just good. And we went there, and there were magic items, they were good, and a horrible Hound of Tyndalos that nearly murdered the cleric of Caden, who cast the spell, multiple times, because we escaped, but then the Hound chased after him back to our kingdom, and then even the cleric was like, why did Lord Caden say wheel?
I should have said wheel and wheel.
And then the answer was just like, to Caden, maybe that challenging adventure just entirely was a fun thing. And then even the cleric...
You lived, right?
You lived, right? You got experience points. So then even the cleric was like, we're never asking Augury to Lord Caden again. We can use the other deities of our kingdom.
But I do consider that to be a case where, like, and in some respects, I consider that I made a mistake there, and I should have said wheel and woe. But it made for a good story, and it helped to build the personality of the deity in our campaign world.
That's right. So now we've given some generic tips. Let's head into past, present, and future. And we're going to start with present. Not past and not future. I know it's not in the order that things occurred, but present is the easiest of the three types of divination. That does not mean that it's easy. Being the easiest, it's still a moderate challenge to handle present divinations.
It's still going to be giving more information than you necessarily plan to give the players on the surface, unless. And I would say one more tip for general things. If you've got a player who always likes to cast divinations about things, then it's probably good to, like, prepare with some additional steps for that. So if you know that, like, your character's like, I'm always going to be going around reading people's minds, or I'm always going to be going around asking the rocks what they saw recently, like, having those kinds of senses as part of what you prep is worthwhile.
Yeah, know what the rocks know, if they always ask the rocks.
Yeah.
But the present is something that you're usually thinking about almost all the time as the GM. You know what's going on in the present. That's what the players are doing right now. Now, you might not know the answer to whatever esoteric divination that the player just pulled up that they've never actually cast before in this game. But, like Linda said, if you check in advance which spells they have, if you know their old mainstays, you can usually predict which kind of divinations they would use and either have it pre-prepared or just sort of get a sense for running that kind of divination.
Like in the Kingmaker game, the party was always going around like asking Desna, hey, is there anything interesting in this hex on the map? Is there anything interesting in this hex on the map? So I knew, okay, I I should prepare for the fact that they're going to cast divination about literally every hex. So whatever hexes might come up in this session, I should know what's there.
Oh, we didn't cast divination about every hex, Linda. We
cast
commune
to Desna.
We
that's
commune
right.
to Desna with our once per week commune
About every single
about
hex.
every
That's
single
correct.
hex on the map. That's correct.
You guys.
It was a higher level divination.
You're right. But you use divination magic on every single hex.
That's right.
In the map.
And so if you know that's going to happen, that can help you prepare. If you get caught flat-footed or off guard without knowing that they were going to cast that spell, it still could pay if you either have lots of information about what's going on so that you know the answer to the question, or if you're generally good at improvising and that's what you do instead of preparing, if you could just improvise that information. Now, you may need to make sure when you improvise it that you write that stuff down, because you just made it up right now to answer your question, but I'm going to warn you about this. Even if you improvised it because you were like, whatever, in your head, that divination spell doesn't matter. Why did they even spend a slot for this? I'll just tell them something I improvised. I guarantee you, your player thought it was worth spending their resources to figure out that divination.
So they're going to dig further into whatever that is.
Even if they don't, they're going to be inclined to think that it was useful. And that it matters. And so if you later say something that contradicts the thing that they discovered from that divination, just because you forgot to write it down and you didn't care, they're going to be like, aha! This divination that said that Lady Windermere's favorite flavor of ice cream was chocolate because I cast favorite ice cream flavor spell. But here at the party, she said that her favorite was vanilla. That must mean she's either lying to hide that she was the murderer, or she was replaced by a doppelganger who doesn't know her favorite flavor of ice cream, or something like that.
Or like, some throwaway statement about like, who did the rock on the ground see walk by, and you're like, yeah, there were 3 guards or whatever, and then you're like, wait a minute, but then I know that these guards went past at 8 a.m. because they said that the light had just recently come up whenever the footsteps came by, and that doesn't line up with whatever.
That doesn't line up with when they said that the guard patrols are. Or wait, no, the guard patrols have 2 guards each.
Yes.
But yeah, Rock said there were 3.
Yes.
That must mean one of the 3 guards was a doppelganger.
The rule of players forgetting minor details of things that you say is not nearly as true whenever they bother to spend a spell on it.
Honestly, there's like an 80% chance your players will forget too.
Yes, but still, they're much more likely to take notes on or remember things that they spent resources.
Since they spent resources to get that information, exactly, they're going to just be inclined to think that it was valuable, because it's the same reason why it's a sunk cost fallacy, right? They sunk a cost into this, so it's some of the most likely things that they will follow up on, and therefore you should write it down to make sure that when they ask Lady Windermere's favorite ice cream flavor again, if you said vanilla, that you on purpose said the wrong one.
Yes.
And then you're like, oh yes, you found the doppelganger, and everyone's like, how did you do that? It's like, well, obviously Lady Windermere likes chocolate ice cream the most. My ice cream favorite divination spell is solve the kidnapping.
Yes. So David asked if Desna ever got a little peeved by that. I mean, the players can interpret that however they like, but Desna did definitely say that some hexes were interesting because, like, they had a hill with pretty flowers on it or a nice vantage point to see a sunset from.
You know what? We didn't mind that. And GM Numbat says favorites ice cream flavors can change all the time. They might.
I mean, they can.
Lady Windermere might be one of those people who doesn't really have a favorite, and so it was just sort of fleeting.
Well, also, like, this is something we've discussed sometimes in prior episodes where, like, there can be assumption that characters are more static than people are and more consistent in their beliefs and actions.
When you change a character, sometimes it makes them more realistic than when you just keep to a script of what you've written down. Absolutely. However, when it's something from one of their divinations, the players are going to really drill into it more likely than for most details. If you just told them, there's like 10 times less likely. If you were like Lady Windermere, but just like, yes, hello, darlings, my favorite flavor of ice cream is chocolate. Then if they cast ice cream divination, that's 10 times more likely that they're going to care about that later because they even bothered to learn the ice cream divination. So other than that fact of having to write down and make sure you keep track of your improvisations or prepare in advance if you know they check everyone's favorite flavor of ice cream, then when you write the character's name and gender and ancestry and
And,
alignment, if you're using alignment.
And gold, general
and
growth
any of
goals,
those,
or
then
whatever
you
you
write
down.
their ice cream flavor on there, because you know that
they're
the
gonna ask
players
because the player
created
casts
a magic
everything.
item that lets them cast the ice cream flavor spell at will,
Yes.
and they cast it on every NPC. So
Yes.
you're like, okay.
All right, this is just
something
my
I
life
write now for every NPC is their favorite ice cream flavor.
Yeah, so there's a few broad categories of these kinds of present divinations that are worth considering. I'd say one of them is kind of like the far sight / far hearing type.
Yes, those are the scrying type spells. Those are, in some ways, they're the easiest to run because you don't have to necessarily give particular information. However, they can be tricky to run because you might not care normally or have determined what is happening. Like if it's like, okay, I'm going to check in the king's private bedchambers right now. And it's like, okay, but we're fighting like the Lich Castle. Yes, but what's happening in the king's private bedchambers? And so you have to think about like what you're going to do there. Are you going to use the overplayed trope of where people are just arbitrarily talking about something important at the exact moment where you happen to be spying?
Hello, King. I wish to explain to you things that you already know in great detail, as if someone were watching us.
Thank you for telling me this thing that we both assumed was already true.
As the spy master, who you know that I am.
Yes, you know that I am the spy master, but I want to remind you that I, Count Roussel, am secretly the spy master of the kingdom.
Yes.
And I will now tell you about the things that we keep from everyone else about the Lich Lord that, honestly, we both know. But just as a reminder, we've changed the secret password for the Spy Master Folio to Mandarin.
Yes.
And you should have received a letter where we said to destroy the letter after you changed the password, but I'm just reminding you that again.
Yes. Well, I did receive that letter, and I put it in a file in the Sapphire drawing room, and I haven't burned it yet. So it's a good thing no one's gonna go break into the Sapphire drawing room through the secret entrance that is conveniently located at the 37th brick on the outside of the castle, facing the east wall by the shrubberies.
So Dave Nielsen in chat suggested the king puts a false vision of a looping illusion that shows a highly convenient seeming scene to foil anybody who's scrying on him.
Now that would be hilarious. That would be great.
Well, it's just like anytime you scry, you see this weird thing, and then you try to go to that Sapphire drawing room, and it's a trap because it's a false vision laid down by the king.
So yeah, I would say be careful with the whole like it's the incredibly convenient. There just happen to be talking about things at that particular time that are super useful. But
it can also feel information about like it can feel frustrating to the players to get nothing. So there's a few things you can do here. One, maybe they actually cast this on the king's bedchamber because they actually had a reason to believe something was happening
going
like
on at that time. Yeah.
That's fine. If they didn't, you can just even say to them beforehand, you can be like, I know in movies that people often are conveniently talking about something where they just spill the beans on stuff that honestly everyone in the room should have already known in a way that's useful, but I do want you to understand before you do this that you're just randomly peeking into the king's bedchambers. The chances that he's going to reveal some huge state secret are fairly low. And then if they're like, yeah, I know. But yeah, if he's in there with somebody he's not supposed to be or something like that, I just want to see what's in his bedchamber. And you say, all right. You may even say, be like, you're not sure if the king has precautions against this, but you can at least give it a shot. And maybe the king didn't have precautions, so they do see the bedchamber, but there's nothing interesting there. And then they're at least I know
the king doesn't have precautions, so I can use it again later. Time. Yeah, but things like people may not be having oddly convenient conversations, but it can be useful to look at who is there and also what is there. Maybe there might be something unusual in the room that they can see, or they can be like, oh, okay, this. Or something that might give them a hint as to what they may want to investigate in the future.
Try to describe something interesting for them to see or notice. And if you're having trouble, because you're just like, for the life of me, I cannot understand, assuming that he wasn't having a tryst in there, I cannot understand why they want to see what's in there, then here's the secret. Before you reveal anything, when they're trying to cast it, you let's say you did that thing, you said, people usually aren't having a highly convenient scene, they're like, I know. Then you can even ask, what are you hoping to see in this? And they might say, well, I am the rogue who works for the king against the Lich, but secretly also the phantom thief who steals from the wealthy. And so I want to know what kind of jewelry and like artwork are in the king's room to see if there's something I would like to steal.
And then you can think,
then you
okay,
can
I
just
don't
start
have to come up with other things. I can
you can just
describe
describe
jewelry and
that,
artwork. That's
and then you
absolutely
know
gonna be
that
there.
that person's going to be happy because that should be in the room.
Yeah.
Whereas if you didn't ask them first and you didn't describe it, then and they just didn't think to ask for you to specify, then maybe you just wouldn't give it to them at all. So figure out what they want to see and at least either temper expectations if you think it shouldn't be in there, or before they cast the spell, or try to give them a little bit of what they want or a lot of what they want if they cast it. Just if they know the king is having a liaison and they cast it right then,
or they cast it like into a meeting room where they know that
a major meeting
is going place. People aren't going to be like, as you know, I the spy master, comma, etc. But they can still. So the way that they speak about things is going to be people who already have underlying knowledge, and the players might need to like roll some checks or do some further research to make sense of what it is that they hear.
Right.
But they're still going to get valuable information in that way.
So one of the other major present type of spells are detection spells that they detect, is something here? Is this right? Is this true? Is this person lying? Are they secretly an angel in disguise? Something like that. So those are usually easy to run. They can just sometimes be annoying that they exist. So if you have something like the Pathfinder 2 system of rarity, where you can, like Linda said before, you can just say this spell is not common and available to most spellcasters in my setting, that's a great way to not have those spells here. If they exist, you might need to work around them by figuring out, this detects if there's a substance that could be poisonous, but not what it is. Alcohol already would detect is that. Therefore, we can slip the poison in the wine.
It's also worth considering, like, measures and countermeasures. There's probably going to be some kind of spell that counters divination. You don't want to be like, my divination PC has a divination spell, therefore everyone they run across has anti-divination. Like, that won't feel fair.
But someone like the king might.
But someone like the king might. Or, like, if they're trying to... If they're like a 5th level character who's trying to use magic to spy on a 17th level character, like, that's a lot more likely that these more powerful characters have ways to counteract what they're up to.
So for more on that, watch our episode, Measures and Countermeasures on Arcane Mark. But beyond that, the far-seeing or anything that detects something that you weren't even thinking of, like the aforementioned ice cream flavor, are kind of the tricks of the present.
I would say there's another category as well. There's sort of like the reading of more details that you might not otherwise be able to get in terms of like thoughts and emotions.
Yeah, that's kind of in the detect line as well. That's detecting things that you might not have already pre-planned what they were going to be.
Yeah.
That is very akin to the ice cream flavor. It's just a little bit less ridiculous sounding than ice cream.
Yeah, but I would say, because that some of the detection stuff we talked about was more of like a yes or no type thing, but this is going to like kind of reveal more information in a way that you might have to think more about. But it does encourage you to think about like NPCs' thoughts and motives and things like that. And there's also, like, in that can be ones about, like, communicating with entities you wouldn't normally be able to communicate with, who might be able to, who might have an unusual way of speaking or thinking about the world, which we talked about in
gods or demons.
Rocks, Trees, Squirrels, and Gods episode.
Yes, the Rocks, Trees, Squirrels, and Gods is our episode about talking to weird things that you wouldn't know how to talk to. So let's move on from the present into the past. So the past has some of the same, kind of pitfalls of the present, but more so. Whereas the future is just the hardest. We'll get to that soon. So if the present was kind of, like it was a moderate difficulty, it's the easiest, but it's not easy. The past can be a little bit hard sometimes because while you're focused on the present, of course you didn't determine every single thing that happened in the past of your setting up to this point. Or if you did, you are an omniscient deity level being in real life.
Yeah.
And I would love to talk to you so we can use your powers for something other than your home campaign setting where you've determined an entire universe's worth of everything that ever happened in the past.
Indeed.
I've got MP complete problems for you to solve. I've got cancers and diseases that need some cures. There's a lot of world hunger. There's a lot of things we can work on.
Okay.
But assuming you're not that omniscient type of deity, you did not come up with everything that ever happened in the past of your setting. And that means that once your players have the ability to figure out what happened in the past, with a legend lore or like some kind of a thing where they do like an object reading or they go to a location and they read retrocognition what happened here. That means that there's an infinite, well, as nigh infinite as the timeline is, which is not quite infinite, amount of time over the entire space of the campaign setting, which creates an exponential amount of possible things that the players could ask about.
Again, this is a place where it's important to look at the scope of the spell and what it's giving, because a lot of these spells are going to be like, you know, what happened in this location at this specific point in time. Or, you know, if it's over a broader period of time, it's going to be things like, what are some of these significant emotional impressions that were left on this item for some kind of an object reading type thing. And you can decide then what those are or narrow the scope drastically. It's also worth considering that you can run into some of those same problems that you do in the present with like, you know, this exact moment in time, is that really exactly when things were going on? There's some things like I'm thinking about in Changeling the Dreaming with the spells that peer into the past. It's sort of like, find this significant thing that happened that I'm looking for, as long as it appeared somewhere in this time window. And that kind of thing can help out if there's a mechanic in Magic that helps you narrow in on exactly what you're looking at. Or like with an object reading type thing, you can sort of decide, okay, well, what is going to be significant about this particular item? But in that case, there's probably going to be other significant things that happen with that item that aren't exactly what the PCs are looking for. Like, unless you're doing something where it's like, yes, you know, this dagger was used as a murder weapon, and then it's lain here on the ground ever since then and never been touched, as this place has decayed into a haunted manor or whatever. Like, there's probably going to be other glimpses of things, and searching through the past, just like any kind of research, is going to often involve digging through the stuff that doesn't matter to find the stuff that does.
So, if you know that your players use these past-based spells, you can come up with some randomized pasts that are based on these spells. So, for example, let's say you have a player that is way too fond of object reading. This is one that, if you're not good at improvising, can be a chore for you at the table, because you don't probably know or care who the previous owner was of a bunch of items, other than ones that they literally picked off of an NPC that you created, then you know who that is. If it was just like this old knife that was found in an ancient ruins from hundreds of years ago, you don't know that like that was from like Bob the Hunter hundreds of years ago, or something like that. So what you can do is just come up with some like generic object readings that you have written down in advance that are good for like different types of objects.
Yeah.
Especially if your players who has object reading is more likely to use it on weapons.
Yeah, you can be like, oh yeah, you know, this was a whittling knife that was used for wood carving.
And you might not know that they're always knives, but try to come up with something that's so generic that it could be used for many different types of weapons.
This weapon was used by a soldier in the...
Right, because a knife could have been used by a soldier in the 30 Years' War. Exactly. And once you've picked one of those backstories, that doesn't mean you throw it out and look randomly at the other ones, because if they find more items from the same area, they could have similar backstories. You could use that first one you chose to like riff off of it and be like, this was actually a knife was used by a medic in the 30 Years' War for surgeries. Yeah, they used knives for that back then rather than some kind of surgery tools.
Yep.
And so you can use just one prompt that you've written in advance to try to help you with multiple divinations, especially if your players have access to a lot of them. These can be tricky, so try to talk with your players before they learn them. It is never necessarily pleasant to find out about a past reading divination that does something obscure that you never even knew existed, but that your player had written down into their spellbook because you have permissive rules for learning new spells, and then they suddenly cast, and
you're just like, oh,
I've never even heard of this spell. And they're like, yep, but according to the rules, I have it, and I now cast it. Try to get on top of those if you can. That's the easiest way to make these work. So, if you do that, they shouldn't be too bad. But the future divinations, which we're now going to get into, now that we have reached the future, we pushed it onto future us to solve this problem. They are the trickiest, because no matter what you think is going to happen in the future, unless you are Thomas the Tank Engine, King of the Railroads, You cannot guarantee that thing is going to happen in the future.
And even more so, like, you know, if you wrote a novel, you can work on making sure that things pay off in the end. But PCs are nothing if not wreckers of everyone's best laid plans, both in and out of character.
If you're the king of railroads, you could just ignore everything they did. And you'd be like, okay, so the king comes out and says, good job defeating the Lich Lord. And then the player's like, what? But we killed the king. And the Lich Lord escaped. And you're like, well, that's what the king says. And then the general's like, yes, look, the Lich Lord's soul cage has been shattered. And thanks to you. And then the player's like, we didn't shatter it. It's like, yes, you did. So if you're that much of a railroader that you...
Thomas the Tank Engine Lord.
Yes, Thomas the Tank Engine Lord of Railroads.
It's like a new boss enemy that keeps trying to force your campaign back on track.
Who just declares that things happened exactly as you wrote in your campaign notes, regardless of what actual reality is.
Like some of those isekais that are like based that, I think in a Otome game or other story that's just violently trying to force the timeline back where it was.
There you go. So, fate forces the timeline back to where it was before. If you're not doing that, you can't be sure. So make it clear to the players in advance, even if the spell doesn't do that, and they usually do if they've been designed well, be like, listen, I'm going to do my best to guess, and this is about the most probable future based on my knowledge as the GM. It could still be wrong, especially if you use the information from the divination to try to avert the future and change it.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, it's one of the reasons why you have the whole Age of Lost Omens in like the Galarian campaign setting, where you say that like prophecy was great for a while and now it doesn't work as well, because there can be issues with working with prophecies that are going to say this is exactly how things are going to go down. So one thing to work on is sort of like, this is a possible future, or like a world that has a concept, and you definitely see this in a fair number of settings, is like where there's the characters are seen as something that are the heroes, or there's major like threads of reality or fate that are tied to these consequential beings that then can go in and mess things up and cause things to change, or like this is the direction that history is currently trending, but things may still be changed if nothing comes in to intervene in some kind of major way. Another thing you can try to do is work on things that are more about, you know, if you think of sort of like, you know, the when blank happens, then here's the result. The initial, that when blank happens. So like if you know, okay, yeah, you know, there's going to be some kind of great volcanic eruption or something like that, and you're like, okay, well, you know, the PCs are very unlikely to be able to prevent this initial precipitating event, but then they can decide how they're going to do it. And so your prophecy talks about, you know, kind of the initial precipitating event, and then some of the things that are gonna come from that.
Another thing you can do, and the most important tool in your toolbox for these future divinations, is to use all of the tools that have been developed across the centuries by real-world fortune tellers when they try to grift people by getting something that sounds good enough that almost no matter what happens in the future, they're like, oh yeah, that's right. So you have many advantages over real-world fortune tellers because you actually know things that are likely to happen,
and you can set aspects of how things go.
So if you say things that are vague enough, you will be right. Like even if the PCs really mess with you, if you say very specifically exact statements that are very, it's like in 3 days at 10:05 a.m. the Lich Lord and the Orc King will play in checkers, and the Orc King will lose. And then it's like that can be wrong very easily. Whereas if you instead talk about how like Bone and Green face off against Red and Black, then Bone crushes Green as Black as Black defeats Red. Then if you later find out that the Lich Lord beat the Orc King by playing Black in checkers against the Orc King, it's like, oh yeah, that was what that divination was. Yeah. Whereas if for some reason the PCs prevent the checker match from happening, it could refer to something else.
Yeah.
So you have enough power and control as the GM that your future divinations are relatively easier to get on track as long as they're not like super specifically statements that the PCs can easily avert.
And that's one thing to consider too, is that like when they get a divination, they're likely to, if it's a divination about something bad happening, they're likely to try to prevent it. So like but I was getting at before about like you can talk about what's rising or what's threatening or like what or like aims or goals or ambitions.
And you say, Linda, that you think they're not going to be able to stop the volcanic eruption, but you forget when we went into outer space and attacked a meteor shower because it was causing all the animals in the kingdom to attack people. Because whenever that meteor shower appears, as long as the phenomenon lasts, which was like a week or some outrageous thing, then all of the animals were going to kill everybody. And we could not be everywhere to stop all of the animals, but we could go into outer space and destroy the meteor shower.
Yep. You guys.
And so we did. It was a good way to prevent that prophecy.
Yep, I'm glad the physics PhDs in our group were willing to overlook some very very dodgy astrophysics.
That's all right, Linda. They're quantum physicists. They don't care.
That's correct.
That's what they always say when we ask them about any other kind of physics.
That's correct. They were saying, hey, sometimes you can start an eruption. Also, the things that can, as something that can be triggered by a lot of different possible ways of going of approach, are also good targets for divinations as well. So they can have multiple meanings and multiple ways of coming about, as long as it doesn't wind up feeling to the players like, like reality is shifting to prevent them from succeeding.
Unless this is a setting where fate and reality do
that. Yeah.
To fulfill prophecies. And that could be a plot point.
Yeah. The plot point could be like, the prophecy has to be fulfilled one way or another, but you can steer things so that the letter of the prophecy will still come true, but the way that it does is better for you.
Like by blocking off the volcanic eruption, but allowing your barbarian to erupt with rage somewhere where you can then stop the barbarian's rage-fueled attacks. Be like, well, there was the eruption from the prophecy. Now we're done.
That would be a fun setting where it's like the prophecies must always come true, so people are constantly trying to engineer ways to make... Can you imagine? It's like, all right, we need to make sure the barbarian doesn't get angry because their eruption could technically be meant to stop our evil plan or whatever.
Exactly. So there's all sorts of interesting things you can do with that. The main point is you want them to feel like their future divination was interesting or useful, even if sometimes it's more of a, in retrospect, that checkers match that we heard about was, that's probably so irrelevant it doesn't matter and they won't be interested in it. But make it be something that they'll either now or later be able to come back and be like, that's what that divination was warning us about.
And even if it's, you're using the fact that the PCs are ones who can change the world, and it's like, that is what the future would have been. The information we gathered from this allowed us to stop that fate.
That's right. And depending on how the divination works, it can even be clear that that is going to be the case, or you could have some kind of item that, like, even changes colors or, like, winks out once that future that was the most likely future is no longer the most likely future.
And you're like, well, we averted that. We're not sure what's going to happen now, but we definitely prevented that bad thing.
That's right. Like, that can definitely be something. Like, I was reading something where one person's magic power, their only power, is that they know what the most likely thing is that was going to kill them at any one particular time. And if anything, like, if that changes, it is very alarming and it will wake them up. Or alert them at the moment. So, like, the way that the prophecies change and divinations change and the futures change can be an element of your setting where people are aware of this, and you can even find out when the future is changing right in front of your eyes. That can be a way to make things more satisfying in a world where you're just kind of letting the PCs really avert futures, but they're also trying to predict them at the same time.
Another thing you can deal with is past prophecies, of the idea that, like, you're building into a story that someone had in the... this might be in a backstory of a character or in a backstory of an NPC where you're building into that they had received a prophecy that let them know something that is currently happening, or that told them that something may happen in the near future.
Absolutely. So, we've done past, present, and future, as well as the general tips. that's about everything I want to say about Divinations here. We have multiple other episodes that we've mentioned about talking to squirrels and gods and everything, and measures and countermeasures. And some of the specific Pathfinder 1 divinations, I think, are all the way back in, like, the third or so episode of Arcade
before
Mark.
I joined,
Long in the past. So there's a lot of places you can look for more information about divinations. And so please like, subscribe, even join if you'd like to support us. And let's do our votes for next Tuesday's episode before we call it a quit.
I think we have a winner. We already have 3 votes, or 4
we have
votes
4
for
votes
3.
for 3. So
From Rico, David,
if you
Matt
want
Guy,
anything
and
other than player tools building to an unusual concept to win, you're gonna all have to vote for the same thing that isn't that. Because 4 people voting at the beginning of the episode for that is a lot. So put a 1 in the chat for Build an Item Workshop, a 2 for Ask Arcade Mark Save My Game Q&A, a 4 for Arcade Mark Plays, a 5 for anything else, and then you can tell me what that is. Or if you want to put the final nail in that coffin, you can vote for 3 for Player Tools. Or do nothing and we'll get Player Tools.
I think we're probably going to get Player Tools.
I think we get Player Tools.
Let's be honest here.
Let's be clear. It's hard to beat a 4-0. All right, everyone. So next Tuesday is going to be Player Tools building to an unusual concept. And this Saturday is going to be...
Build a Deity Workshop.
Build a Deity Workshop. So come with an idea for a concept of a deity. And we're going to build that deity out on our next episode.